I'm going to introduce Rachel Coldicutt. She is the director at Care for Industries and really knows her stuff in this space, like really is a Tyson when it comes to collective imagination and moral imagination, etc. So thank you so much, Rachel, for being here, and I'll pass over to you.
Hi. Yeah, and so the purpose of this chat today is to really think about, a lot of the time when we're thinking about tech ethics, we're thinking about minimizing harms, we're thinking about how technology works, and we're not really thinking as much about kind of where we could be moving. And it really feels like a big piece of the regulatory landscape that is missing now is, where do we actually want to get to? Rather than constantly thinking about the problems, can we actually, I don't know, do a little bit more work of creating positive alternatives? And when I was putting this together, the first thing I thought was that actually really we'll hear loads over the course of CogX about technology and different kinds of ways that technologists are thinking about the future. But we're not as likely to hear as much about the perspectives that come out of different kind of communities, from place-based work. And that actually, I really wanted to bring in the guests on the panel today to talk about the different ways that they are creating tangible alternatives and lifting up other kinds of communities. And that's a real opportunity for us, I think, as technologists and as people who are thinking about ethics, to just be kind of more practical and more rooted. So if I could bring in my two panelists, Cassie and Imi. Hi, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you both to introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about what you're working on and thinking about at the moment. Cassie, would you like to go first?
Yeah, hi, it's really nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Rachel, and always lovely to see both of you. So I am the Deputy Director of Funding Strategy at the National Lottery Community Fund, and it's a real privilege to work somewhere like that, because we are the largest, or one of the largest, grant funders of community activity across the UK, which means I get to be connected to and hear about some of the most amazing work happening on the ground, of which Imi's work is some of that. And in my role, I look after a whole bunch of different funding programs, which includes the Climate Action Fund, the Digital Fund, our Emerging Futures Fund, and some others. But I also do work across the fund around innovation policy and practice. And what does that mean I'm thinking about? I did start a list in preparation, and it was quite long, so I'll try and keep it short. I mean, at the moment, some of the things that are most present for me are, you know, obviously we're coming into another phase of the pandemic, which means that we are thinking about what needs to happen next. And so I've been doing quite a lot of work around what does it mean to resource our kind of collective imaginations, and what's the infrastructure that we need to invest in for that. I'm also doing some work around kind of collective intelligence and collective wisdom, and if we're going to move into some more participatory approaches to grant making, for example, how are we making sure we're drawing on all kinds of different intelligences? And then another area of interest is community-owned technology. So in civil society in the UK, everyone is talking about powerful communities, community power, levelling up. But can we really have powerful communities if they're running entirely on privately owned tech platforms? So that's another thing that I'm looking at.
And Imi.
Hi, thank you so much, and lovely to see you both. I'm Imi. I'm one of the co-founders of an organisation called Civic Square. Civic Square's had a nearly 10-year history in organising around civic infrastructure and what it looks like at the city and now neighbourhood level, and what it means to involve people of places in that work. Now, particularly what I'm interested in at the moment, and our work is really the role of civic infrastructure as we transition through our current times. We know that infrastructure in all of its soft and hard and tangible and intangible ways is really crucial in how societies transition well, and with the cascading challenges and risks that we face, from climate breakdown to the huge technological revolution we're going through. What sorts of infrastructures do communities and people and neighbourhoods need at their doorsteps in order to transition in an equitable and just way? So lots of what that looks like means playing and working and organising at a number of different layers at the neighbourhood level in Birmingham, where we are based. And those 3 layers we kind of organise around are the dark matter, the invisible structures that we don't see, that we need to visibilise, such as land and ownership and how things are financed, how capital circulates, how it flows, what's happening in all of those invisible structures that drive so much of the change that we know drives our material reality. And then what we talk about in terms of the ordinary matter, the everyday extraordinary experiences you see, feel, touch, the things that you go to, the infrastructures that are just there in your neighbourhood, and how you feel and experience often everyday life, and how do we bring those ideas into the everyday reality. And then this space of the dream matter, which I'll talk about a bit more today, and through one of the projects that we are working on called the Department of Dreams, which is how we look at creating space for people's imaginations, our collective imaginations about what is possible, and that radical reimagination of who we could be collectively is a really key part of that. And so for us, we feel like playing at these different and organising at these different layers together allows us to start understanding both the big and the small and the everyday and the tangible and intangible shifts that we need to make in order for our societies to equitably transition. And I could talk more about examples of that later, but that's just a bit of an overall into Civic Square.
Great, thank you. So I was on a panel here this morning where one of the things we're being asked about is what do we think about the power of educating individuals and helping individuals to kind of change their own destiny. And it comes back, I think, again and again and again, that in the technology space, we've come to a point where we're incredibly individualized, even when we think or feel like we may be kind of acting collectively. And that it feels to me like it's very difficult to make positive change alone, particularly, if we're in an environment where, data is being collected about us as individuals by whether it's government or business or maybe both of them together. We don't have any chance to be creating the alternatives that we would like if we're living in a world where we're just very individualized and technology dependent. And I guess one of the things that's really inspiring about both of your work is the way that you're joining up on the ground infrastructure with kind of collective dreaming and imagining. And it'd be great to hear kind of more about what that actually looks like, because it sounds, I guess, fairly abstract. I don't know, Imi, if you would like to go first, and maybe we can all have a chat and just all be coming in. That's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Rachel. So I guess the Department of Dreams as a part of our work was really about how at a neighbourhood level we are able to create space for, invest in and resource people's dream capacity, their imagination capacity, and we did last year, supported by a number of funders, including Cassie's Emerging Futures Fund, a series of programming and a neighbourhood-wide, national at that time, Dream Fund, where we invested micro grants into more than 100 ideas and ways of working, from tools to events to things that people wanted to do to move out of their current reality and to be able to create collective in their neighborhoods, in their cities, in their organizations, spaces to unlock that imagination. And we've been part of a cohort, which I'm sure Cassie will tell you about, that have been doing lots of very similar things. Now, if we were talking about I don't know, using language that sometimes is used in the tech space as well, in our theory of change around that, there's loads and loads of different parts of this work that need to be unlocked collectively. And so for me, it isn't just about lots and lots of micro grants and lots of small ideas. At the neighborhood scale, creating the capacity for transformation, creating the capacity, creating the resources, creating the platform where people are participating, people are building trust, people are able to hold many different futures and plural ideas about what the future could look like together, building on wisdom, histories, and the both collective imagination, but also the many different plural visions of the future together is really important. Now, the last part of that for me is that then doesn't, or not the last part, the next part of that story isn't just that we, you know, create this space and then we have no tangible route to the future. One such example I'll talk about as an example is the interplay between a number of cascading crises and opportunities that we face. We have a project that we're working on, it's quite in the background at the moment, that builds on this idea that we need to retrofit homes 1 every 5 seconds in Europe to meet the 2030 targets, right? We know we have the technology for that. We know that the large centralized programs where middle class people get vouchers to put some solar panels on their roof hasn't really worked at the scale that we need to move, and quickly. We also know we've got technology for micro factories at the neighborhood level. We know that we've got massive job shortages and lack of good work, and we need to transition a lot of people out of old industries into new ones. When you start to put these different ingredients together and you start to be able to say, well, hold on, couldn't we have a neighborhood-led technological revolution of micro factories where people are getting good jobs, where people are trading in skills of the 21st and 22nd century, and they're actively working on challenges that we know are crucial to how we are going to be able to even live and function together in the future at pace. Now, that is an act of collective imagination. At a neighborhood scale, you need to be able to build people's capacity, trust, confidence. You need to layer in tech, you need to layer in visions of futures that aren't centralized and just massive privately owned or huge state funded interventions. And what that can do is create ways in which we can spread these sorts of ideas in a ground up and I don't really want to use the binary of ground up and top down, but what this means is that, you know, when we start from literally the household, literally from the street, and we can start from even creating the space for people to imagine that the future can be built, created, nurtured, stewarded, ushered in different ways, you don't actually need to do that much more, because I feel like we have a lot of the ingredients, and what our places need is architects of that imagination, of that resource, of that technology. And going back to my initial point is, what we need to be able to do is create the capacity and the infrastructure and the resources for us to transition well. The creativity exists within our neighborhoods and in our places to really go through that in very different ways. So I'm really interested in how you create the conditions for the things that often feel incredibly far away to feel tangible, possible, and for people to feel it's okay to say, hey, we might not just want to go blindfolded down this road. And also, finally, the many different embodied, lived, learned experiences, the wisdom from many different backgrounds, histories are relevant, important, if not essential, in how we build new relationships with the future.
And I'm really struck, kind of listening to that, is that a really important part of what you're doing is you're making a space where complexity thrives, you know, and you're bringing things together that are not being ironed out into their own categories. There's not a dominant vision. There's a you know, and you're creating an opportunity where, in a way, in a kind of straightforward, top-down, capitalist, technology-driven way of working, these things wouldn't be possible. But actually, when you create like the binding for people to come together,
and I really want Cassie to come in, but just speaking right to that point is just one little thing around. I think when we organize it in certain ways, we'll talk about it in a way of like building system consciousness. Our friends at Dark Matter Labs will talk about visibilizing the invisible, and visionaries at Healing Justice London will talk about creating the capacity for transformation. And what I feel is that there's something around, and I probably haven't articulated it well enough yet, but in really finding the space where communities can thrive, and in that complexity, in that interdependence, where we feel freed by the fact that things are complex and we're going to have to find different routes there, as opposed to just bound up in it. So I am really passionate about what you've just talked about, Rachel, which is I don't want to silo off what we feel communities can do, because who are communities, right? They're made up of all the people we decided whose voices were important to platform, and who we just thought, it's not, I don't know, it's not just people sitting having picnics under bunting, it's all of us, right? And that's the word, like, I mean, I love a picnic under bunting. If you saw our Twitter,
amazing.
We did amazing. But the point is that, when we're thinking about this, we've got to be able to like create a new narrative that we have in fact, we've got the best levels of capacity to deal with that complexity. The fact that we've centralized it and created very linear routes to the future is actually the problem. So I'm interested in how we keep the freedom around that interdependence, that complexity, and actually really show how much asset and joy and capability exists in our communities to solve some of our most complex challenges.
Cassie, right, one of the things that's making me think about, and like we've spoken about this loads in the past, is that scale, in the way that technologists talk about scale, is kind of a problem here, in a way, in that it's not that you do something once and you get it right and you replicate it. How are you thinking about this when you're looking across your portfolio and thinking about lots of different communities at once?
I mean, I would say I'm thinking about it and maybe attempting to do it, but I wouldn't say that we're doing it yet. But I think, so with the Emerging Futures Fund, which Imi sort of touched on, where we've had these 52 grants across the UK, rooted in communities, working with people that bring kind of rigor and expertise in some of the different practices around collective imagination. I guess I'm trying to think of that as we did this event last week on imagination infrastructuring, and the infrastructuring feels important because it is trying to account for that idea that these are necessarily small parts loosely joined, or their own ecologies in different contexts, but they do need linking and strengthening to actually influence change. So in terms of scale, I guess it's the infrastructuring, or the infrastructure that needs the scale, which I think of more as about long-term investment, basically, long-term investment in something that is of the public good, and the scale is it's the infrastructure. And then in another funding program that we haven't sort of fully announced yet, but we've started to do 10-year grants in one of our more experimental funding programs, because obviously we're huge as a fund, so we do lots of very responsive crisis type funding, but we have had the opportunity to do these 10-year grants. And of course, that requires thinking entirely differently about time, pace, what you measure, what accountability looks like. And actually in that, we're talking much more about depth and progress, and not impact and scale, and a lot of the kind of language that's very dominant in the tech world.
So like, how do you know when that's working, and can you set criteria at the beginning, or is it more movable?
Well, we don't know if it's going to work yet. I mean, I suppose what you're doing is you're saying that you're investing, or certainly from my personal perspective, you're investing in a group of people and initiatives that have a new philosophy or a new logic model for how the world can be different, and everything about how they are in the world is already enacting that. So it's almost like that patterning of the new in how they report, what they notice, how they behave, how they're working in collaboration, and yeah. So with that, you know, I always say anyway, like, change is always happening and change is changing. I didn't say the change is changing, someone else did anyway. And you know, you can always identify and demonstrate and make visible progress towards something. So, you know, we aren't able to, we don't want to talk about outcomes or impact. That doesn't feel right for complexity. But we also do want to think about measurement and rigor, because actually just saying, oh, it's all emergent and we don't really know what's going to happen, it is also not appropriate, or it's certainly not appropriate when you're spending public money, and it's not fair on the work, because the work will be changing things and influencing things. So yeah, I guess it's that ongoing learning, demonstrating, being clear about what kind of evidence will make sense of the kind of progress and world that you're trying to pattern that's new. And Imi might be able to talk more to that too, because she'll have been thinking about it.
Yeah, I'm happy to build on that a little bit. So I often give like this big caveat that if it was completely up to me, I wouldn't be doing Civic Square. What I would be doing is collectively and collaboratively retrofitting our national library infrastructure for the 21st and 22nd century, right? They would be the town halls for social change, the place of dreaming, imagination, learning. Books would still be there. They'd be there in abundance, of course, for all the mad library fans out there. But librarians and their role as connectors, as people who understand the context, understand the information and resource they have access to, but they would also have so much more, wouldn't they? Right? Like technologists here would talk about all the things that would look like. But in Eric Kleinenberg's book, Palaces for the People, he talks about in another huge time of industrial transition and change. And Carlota Perez talks about the 40-year transition we're finding ourselves in. Infrastructure like the libraries were critical. So the Carnegie Library System, even though I know it was a big, very rich old man who invested in them for both probably some legacy, but also because he saw that actually no amount of centralized trying to make his workers get more knowledge was going to work, right? You had to put centers of knowledge and resource at the corner of every neighborhood. So 400 Carnegie libraries were built over 40 years across America and other places. So there was democratic access to resources and tools. When you go to a library, someone's not sitting there and reading books to you. They're not reading the thing to you. You're going and you have access to the things you need to grow your collective, or maybe individual in that case, knowledge and access to that. So for me, I think that when we're thinking about how do we know when things are going well, is that of course, someone like me, Imi from the corner of Birmingham, is not suddenly going to create a new National Library retrofit strategy.
Why not?
If anybody here wants me to do that, this is actually very much what I'd love to do. But what we can do is show what that can look like. And what good looks like for me is being able to really understand how we can, as Cassie says, invest in that work, invest in the transitional, whether we want to call it R&D or experimental work, that can allow there to be islands of coherence, corners where things are starting to come together well. And when we know things are going well, it will feel like the libraries and the parks and the high streets, because we will no longer be forcing that onto anyone, because actually the tools that you need to transition well, to live life well as a society are there. And tech has a massive part to play in that. I just don't think massive monopolistic, privately owned tech is the answer. But, you know, talk to me about modern MMC and making techniques and, you know, what we saw with COVID and the need for digital infrastructure and broadband and everything. Yeah, I'm here for all of this. It's not really about whether it's technology or not. It's about the dark matter of it, how it's owned, how it's financed, how it's nurtured and stewarded and maintained locally. So when do we know things are going well? We know things are going well when it feels as normal as the park, when it feels as normal as the fruit shop on the high street. And we know we are going through a phase where that's not going well. So I feel like we have to really get into investing in that transition and investing in all the different types of infrastructure, of which tech cuts through all of that, as opposed to there's this tech revolution and then there's just everybody else doing their bits. But, you know, the real savior is going to be that massive, you know, technological revolution, when in reality it's going to cut through every part of our life and touch every part, from imagination to the high street, to the infrastructures we see and feel, to the way we own stuff. Our pals at Dark Matter Labs are doing a great job of this, showing how tech touches every part of life, and what that might look like. Yeah, so that's how I know things are going well.
And like, one of the things, like, I think this is probably like the last question before we open up to questions. Like, one of the things I think has happened with kind of internet and digital technologies over the last 20 odd years is that they've allowed the vision of a very small number of people to drive the dominant tools. Like there's a lot of smoothing that happens, you know, and sometimes that smoothing might have the effect of polarizing us and pushing us apart, because we're all being kind of like sanded down to fit into the visions of a relatively small number of people. And I guess like what I'm hearing from both of you is the importance of pluralism, complexity, allowing lots of things to flourish at once. And I guess, you know, because this is a technology conference, I'm going to kind of leave you with almost like a question about tools, because like, Amy, when you were like, there's a difference between, like, there's two different things I think that we have here. We have the idea of spaces where people gather, and then we have tools where people can make things. And I think the idea of spaces has mapped very comprehensively onto how people think about things like Facebook and WhatsApp and all those kinds of things. But, you know, when I started out working on the internet years and years ago, it was very easy to make things. It was very easy to subvert them and take them over and turn them into what it was you wanted to do. And so I guess, like, my question is, like, if there was a tool, if there was a thing that everyone could have that you could sort of give to your communities, is there anything that comes to mind? Or is there a sort of bigger, more structural change you'd like to see?
I hope Cassie might do bigger and more structural. So I'll because I think it's an interplay. I do think it's an interplay of all of these things. I'm not one of these people who don't really see the huge benefit and transformation we've seen with all the different platforms. Yeah, my questionable governance, this idea of molding us down into this very small way in which we use them, I think is actually not just dangerous for what sort of power that concentrates into the hands of a few people, but it's also really not smart. It just reduces our cognitive capacity, and we need to be at the most creative, most flourishing plural versions of figuring out how we are going to get through the shit that we have created, right? Especially in the West, where we're also plied with a very single way of being able to see how to solve challenges. So if there was a platform or a thing that I would put at the heart of the neighborhood, it would be a make and maintain space. Put in democratic access of technology like MMC and all the stuff that we know that can make community built homes, can retrofit homes, can create good jobs, can all the things that we know from the Fab Lab movement, but in a much more rooted problem solving type way. That also creates the capacity for innovation and new things to be in the hands of people everywhere. And secondly, maintenance is going to be such an important part of our future. As we get out of this make, throw away, reuse, we're going to have to become much better stewards of our places, of the land we're on, of the way we maintain technology, of resources, etc., etc. So if there was one thing I could bolt onto the side of every library, it'd be a maker and maintain space that's focused on unlocking creative capacity, imagination, but also very focused on practical, great jobs and challenges that we have, particularly around housing and retrofitting homes.
Cassie, what do you think?
I guess from a more of an institutional perspective, and we've talked about this a lot, Rachel, and it sort of links a bit to some of the work you're doing with us and hopefully a group of other funders at the moment around the Foresight Observatory. But it's like the drawing of community wisdom much further upstream in the kind of way we even conceive of and imagine technology and its role in our lives. And I suppose that's, for me, so much of the kind of the digital world it wants to standardize everything, and that's really important for some things like our transactional government or health services, so that has a role, but the messy, complex, plural futures that are the much more human reality are disserved by that kind of mindset. And I feel like, if institutions recognized the need to start much more upstream in the design of technologies, it would create something that was more appropriate for more people.
Right, and I would add, when I was on a panel earlier today, there was a question about dashboards. Anyone who knows me knows I'm very skeptical about the dashboards, because the dashboards are like an ultimate smoother, but they do another thing as well. It's like when you are relying on data, you can only use the data that is available. You can only use the data that it previously occurred to you to collect, right? And that I think there's this real irony about how we think about data as being a thing that will take us into the future, whereas really almost all data is information about what has happened in the past, and it's collected and organized in ways that reflect how people have understood things in the past. And I think there's a really interesting challenge in what we've been talking about today, is kind of how can we bring a bit of the grit back, right? How can we make it okay to responsibly hold a space where we don't know exactly what the outcome is, and to adapt and learn over time? and how can we kind of allow things that have never occurred to us to happen and celebrate those. Now, I think, I'm just checking the time, I think we've got 3 minutes left. I don't know if there's anything either of you would like to leave everybody with.
I mean, one other thing I was just going to say that I don't think we've covered, but you know, just going back to why some of what I'm focusing on at the moment around this idea of collective imagination is, you know, whilst I agree with Imi that there's loads of creativity in communities, I do think we're underestimating the kind of the complexity and scale of the challenges that we already have and are coming our way. And you know, Jeff Mulban talks about crisis of the imagination, and I do feel that there's certainly so many people that are so under-resourced, burnt out, like vulnerable, like really having a hard time. And if we don't, people that have resource, if we don't resource the spaces and places for people to come together and imagine, I don't think we're gonna make the leaps that we need in our thinking about what's possible.
Great, thank you. I think that is probably a great note to close on.